Would you, as a Chancellor, who's just said you want to be honest and people have to be prepared for tough decisions, would you be prepared to ignore the recommendations of the independent bodies and risk a period of strikes with the unions by not giving them the pay rises they seek?
What's interesting as well is the framing here. Well, the tough decision that you could make is not increasing taxation on rich people, your donor class. What makes a harder choice is the fact that these people are organised. If these people weren't organised, the choice would be incredibly simple. If these particular sectors didn't have union representation, it would be very easy for the government to go, well, actually, it's hard to get rich people to pay their taxes, but it's very easy to get unorganised workers to accept low pay, so we'll just make them accept low pay. But now she actually does have a tough choice because of the fact that they're unionised. And that's what's important about joining a trade union. It's very easy for people to not bother having to pay you properly. It's much harder when you actually have collective action on your side.
Really value public service workers in our schools, in our hospitals, in our police as well. At the moment, we are looking at those pay review body recommendations, doing the analysis, and we will work with public sector workers on that. And later this month, we will make announcements around public sector pay when we do that full analysis of the public finances and public spending. But we also know that there is a cost to not settling, a cost of further industrial action, a cost in terms of the challenge that we face in recruiting and retaining doctors and nurses and teachers as well. But we'll do it in a proper way and make sure that the sums add up.
There's a question of
What's interesting there as well is it's not exactly ruling it out. Obviously, I covered this yesterday with that interview between the NEU head, Daniel Kebede, and someone from Times Radio. Say, well, industrial action will be inevitable if they don't meet somewhere close to what the independent pay review bodies are recommending for public sector pay increases, which is 5.5%, which is, you know, that's a reasonable amount to be paying these people because they do need pay restoration because public sector pay has lagged behind private sector pay since 2014. That's like a decade of underpay for public sector workers. And Rachel Reeves is right. She's absolutely right. This is what I was saying yesterday. If they don't deal with these problems now, that's going to create a recruitment and retention crisis later down the line. So she's actually signalling much more towards being more lenient on pay demands than people were otherwise expecting, but still being pretty tight-lipped over the reality by saying, well, we're going to look at the books first.
Principle, though, and when you were asked about this in opposition, you said that the most important thing to you was your commitment to your spending limits, those fiscal rules as they are known. So I'll ask again, in principle, are you willing as Chancellor to ignore the recommendations for increasing the pay for teachers and other public sector workers?
We'll set that all out later this month.
But I value
the work that public sector workers do. They provide a huge service to our country. But we will set it out in the proper way later this month. People won't have long to wait. We will do that before this month is out.
And I can see you don't want to give the detail of what decision you may make, but there is an important question of principle here. Ministers are expected in normal times to follow the recommendations of the independent pay review bodies. That's the point of having them, isn't it, to take the politics out of it.
I totally understand that. And we are in a position where the previous government gave a mandate to the pay review bodies, but they haven't properly factored in the cost of it. That is what this review will be about.
What's interesting as well is they're not that independent. They're obviously appointed by the state, so there is some level of politicking behind the scenes. Well, obviously, when Rachel Reeves said, well, they've not costed in having these pay increases being properly met. And when she was also signalling the other way earlier by saying, oh, we really respect our public sector workers, which seems to me like she's trying to placate people who are part of the trade union movement before not acquiescing to what the pay review body says, but maybe falling slightly short. We shall see. Again, all of this is kind of smoke and mirrors at time of recording.
Looking at the state of the public services, the state of the public finances, but there is also a cost of not settling, because the cost of this ongoing industrial action, the cost of failing to be able to recruit and retain the doctors, the nurses and teachers, that also has an impact on our economy. But I've just come back to this point. You know, we are in a situation where there are huge spending pressures and our economy is so weak it is not generating the tax revenues that we need to fund our public services. It's why we have to grow our economy, because otherwise we'll just continue for the next 5 years having these conversations of how can you afford this, how can you afford that. The only way that we're going to be able to afford the public services that our country needs and deserves, whilst also being able to keep taxes low, is to have an economy that is generating the wealth and prosperity, which is why...
There's already loads of wealth and prosperity in the economy already, Rachel. It's just all in the hands of incredibly rich people. We've got more billionaires than we've ever had. We still have the 6th biggest economy in the world. There is plenty of wealth there that we could be using to be able to fund public sector workers, but you don't want to raise taxes. That's the problem. You could do that if you wanted to. That would be a tough decision, but you're choosing not to do it. You can't say, oh, the only way to get the wealth is to grow the economy. And I say, it's fine to want to grow the economy. It's good to want to grow the economy. I agree. The Corbyn manifesto was pro-growth. I'm not an anti-growth person. I'm not a degrowther, for example. Despite the fact I do recognise degrowth as a legitimate political position on this one. But myself personally, I'm pro-growth. But that doesn't preclude you from using the wealth that has currently been there, that it's in the hands of too few people, and redistributing that to people who do need it, which is public sector workers, very specifically.
Second, but on this very important question of this recommendation of 5.5% pay increases for public sector workers, if you went ahead with that, what would the effect on your spending plans be? Because that is a huge amount of money that was not planned for. It would blow your numbers, wouldn't it?
It's about £3 billion. So again, there are some easy taxes that you could use to be able to pay for that. Wouldn't cost very much at all. It's not a huge amount.
Well, you know the fiscal rules, that we are going to balance day-to-day spending with tax receipts. We'll get debt down as a share of our economy by the end of the forecast period, and then subject to that, invest in the things that we need to grow our economy. Those fiscal rules are non-negotiable. We will do a budget in the autumn. I will set the...
She said the meme, chat. She said the meme.
Date for that budget and the spending review when I make the statement to Parliament later this month. But we will do things in a proper way. Every time that we do a budget, we will have a forecast from the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility. Earlier this week in the King's Speech, we announced a bill for budget responsibility, including a fiscal lock. So never again can a Prime Minister or Chancellor do a budget, or a mini-budget as they called it, with unfunded commitments around tax and expenditure, because we saw what happened with the Conservatives' mini-budget with £45 billion of unfunded commitments. No one got those tax cuts. What they did get is huge increases in their mortgage rates, which is why fiscal responsibility and financial stability is the cornerstone of everything that I will do as Chancellor of the Exchequer.
What was interesting about Laura Kuenssberg discussion here with Rachel Reeves over public sector pay is that she discussed the ramifications of the way in which Rachel Reeves answered these questions on newscast as well. Now, I think the answers that she gives here and the way in which Kuenssberg analyses this just shows you the kind of ideological world that Laura Kuenssberg lives in. Let's have a listen.
If the public sector review bodies recommend 5.5% and the expectation was 3%, does she gain by giving 4.5%? Is that still an inflation-busting pay rise?
Yeah, because inflation's now down to 2%. Inflation's at normal and might even go down a bit.
I don't know.
Right, so this framing is crazy. This framing is absolutely crazy. Remember when I told you, chat? So back when the NHS staff were initially balloting for strike action, it's like 18 months ago, long-term viewers will remember this very specifically, when I made the very specific claim that the reason why the Conservative government didn't want to negotiate with NHS workers and were trying to push those negotiations back whilst being threatened with strike action in the NHS with nurses and junior doctors, the reason why I specifically said this was because I knew that the Conservative deliberate plan was waiting down the clock. They knew full well that the inflation would go through the system eventually and that they didn't have to do anything. They could just wait and inflation would go down. The nominal yearly value of inflation, the headline value of inflation, is only for the last 12 months in terms of how much prices have risen. It doesn't tell you how much prices are relative to how much they were 3 years ago or 4 years ago or 10 years ago, for example. It doesn't tell you what real terms pay looks like. It just tells you how much prices have risen within the last 12 months. So the Conservative government were deliberately trying to push back strike action with the deliberate desire to make sure that the headline figure of inflation would be falling during those negotiations, to make any pay increase that the doctors or the nurses were looking for, such as, for example, the current 35% demands of pay restoration for the junior doctors, seem more far-fetched, to seem less reasonable. A 35% pay increase for the junior doctors, for example, in relation to headline inflation rates of 16% when these negotiations started, looks more reasonable when you look back at the historical pay freezes for these sectors of the economy, when you compare it to that level of inflation. But now it's now 2%. This 35% pay increase, it optically looks much less realistic, much less reasonable. But their pay is still behind in real terms. Public sector pay in this country has basically been below inflation ever since 2014. It's been dragging behind private sector wages. Real terms pay for loads of public sector workers is lower now than it was in 2010. They have continually had decreasing real terms wages. What Laura Kuenssberg is doing with this very specific phrasing, by saying, oh, well, is it inflation busting pay rise because it's now 2% and they're getting 4.5%. But they haven't had inflation meeting pay rises for the last 14 years, and definitely not for the last 3 years since the inflationary period started. Even if you take it back to 2021, a 5% pay rise now still leaves them 6 percentage points at the very least, behind where their real terms pay would be, just to stay static in terms of their consumptive power from 2021. And this is exactly what the Tories were doing, trying to say, oh, well, you can't have 35% pay rise, you can't have 5% pay rise, you can't have 11% pay rise or whatever, because the headline level of inflation has now gone down. Despite the fact, again, these people are not looking at their real terms wages historically. This is why it's really important that we frame the junior doctors' demands as pay restoration and not pay rises. The same is true with all of other public sector workers. They have had their pay frozen for loads of parts of the Conservative government under Osborne and Hammond, and then under Sunak and Hunt as Chancellor of the Exchequer, they had pay rises, were still below keeping their real terms pay at least static. Their consumptive power has massively dropped, and it's dropped even further than people's in the private sector have. They would need more than this 5.5% to even reach the same level as how private sector wages look at the same time. So this framing here is incredibly disingenuous, and there to make Rachel Reeves look better and say, oh, well, even if she doesn't give them what the pay review body recommends, oh, it's still an inflation-busting pay rise because inflation's now 2%. How ridiculous is that? At least independent pay review bodies know you have to get pay restored to where it was previously, now that the inflationary period has passed over. But Laura Kuenssberg is desperately doing agitprop for the government here by praising Rachel Reeves for busting inflation when she wouldn't have done anything of the sort, even if she did meet what the independent pay review bodies have recommended as a wage. This is crazy dishonest from Laura Kuenssberg. Crazy dishonest. Why would we want to tarnish our relationship with the government as a lobby journalist? We might lose access. No, we're just going to frame them as absolutely doing everything the union should be wanting, when really and truly, anything lower than what the pay review body is recommending would be drastically behind keeping their real terms pay where it should be to make up for 14 years of austerity. Crazy. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership to just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.